Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. The scientific method of destruction, perhaps the greatest contradiction in our lives, the hardest to handle, is the knowledge, there was a time when I was not alive, and there will come time when I am not alive. All that we know is embedded inside our minds, and for all that to be absent from the universe is not comprehensible. This is a basic undeniable problem of life. Perhaps it is the best metaphorical analog of Gödel's theorem. Quote by Douglas Hofstadter, Gödel, Escher, Bach. Truth and Death. Philosophy, Cosmology, Singularity, New Jersey. I trace my ancestry about 13.7 billion years to the so-called Big Bang. What I am is literally inseparable from the history of the evolution of particles, galaxies, stars, planets, chemistry, biology, and finally, cultural technological evolution. 1416 The evolutionary descent of me, my species, and my kindred life forms from Earth, are particular extensions of the larger scheme of physical evolution. The heavier elements necessary for life on Earth, such as carbon and oxygen, were produced within special conditions of the high temperature and high pressure within stars and arrived Earth through star deaths called supernovas. While red dwarfs, which constitute the majority of stars, are long surviving and slowly fading, it is the heavier, massive stars that end in extremely luminous supernovas explosions that blast these life-giving heavier elements into interstellar space. At the moment of its demise, enough energy can be released to outshine its entire home galaxy. The extreme conditions of the shock wave of that violent death allow for the otherwise highly improbable synthesis of the heaviest elements such as gold and uranium. Our bodies are made possible and physically descended from the ejected matter of these ancestral stars that have ended as supernovas. Out of their elemental remains in our planet, life forms emerged about 4 billion years ago. From this late biological phase, I count myself as, among other things, genetic replicator, eukaryote, animal, vertebrate, gnathostome, chordate, mammal, primate, ape, Homo sapien, and Jew. If there is no absolute objectivity, self-inclusive objectivity would seem to amount to unraveling a specific past human subjectivity. If the motivation for objectivity fundamentally subjective, then it matters from an objective standpoint that I am a Jewish American and an American Jew. It matters that I grew up in New Jersey and that I can trace my ancestry to my fish fathers of the Cambrian era. There is no universalism. As far as I can see, I can find no sound reason to posit a fundamental distinction between generalizations and particulars. If even the laws of physics evolved over history, then there is no strict universalism even in physics, and a theory of all raises questions about the empirical example of the theorist who posits an understanding of all. The possibility of absolute objectivity is probably as plausible as its opposite, the possibility of absolute subjectivity. For example, I have an apparent need to put food in my body as a condition of my existence. If I attempt to be absolutely subjective, I can imagine a utopic world where I would have no need to concern myself with objective conditions such as my body's apparent need for food. Is it possible to live a totally solipsistic existence in total indifference to sense perception such as sight, hearing, and touch? Much that goes by the name of postmodernism seems to virtually assume as much. But is the theory that products of the scientific method are invented instead of discovered itself invented rather than discovered? Is the assertion that science is a dogma itself a dogma? Science, it appears, is only an extension of the common capacity to observe one's environment, a capacity that is not limited to human beings. If human science evolved from the evolutionary benefits of accurate representation of the environment, then the descent of science can be traced to pre-human origins, and this, in turn, suggests a general socio-biological explanation for scientific behaviors. It appears that science begins with natural selection for those accurate observations of our environment that are also genetically adaptive. To illustrate, Consider one explanation for the sudden development of most major complex animal groups in a relative short time frame: the Cambrian explosion. The evolution of eyes is still a controversial explanation and may turn out to be wrong or, more likely, incomplete. 1417. If it is the case that the evolution of eyes was a crucial factor, then the Cambrian explosion can be interpreted as a primitive advancement in the evolution of science, a kind of pre-human scientific technological revolution. Just as the telescope expanded the range of human eyesight, the evolution of eyes in the Cambrian period expanded the capacity for accurate, scientific observations of the environment, which in turn had a genetically adaptive value. The biological technology for eyesight was passed on through genes instead of culture, but the cultural evolution of modern science is only a continuation. This ancient evolutionary scientific technological interrelationship. The evolution of modern science technology has led to an acceleration of technology's ability to outstrip biology, and there is sound reason to think that technology is on course to overtake biology as a continuation of evolution. My own behavior in directing objectivity towards my own subjectivity and the translation of this information into symbols or memes may even be an expression of this encroaching paradigm shift. The paradigm shift from biology to technology may culminate in what is called the technological singularity, the evolution of greater than human intelligence, i.e. artificial intelligence. Consider the rise of artificial intelligence in comparison with the rise of human intelligence. When the ancient Greeks first blazed the path towards what is now known as Western philosophy, they reached towards a cosmological perspective. Philosophy, from the beginning, groped towards a rational understanding of everything. If the perspective singularity ultimately becomes like a black hole in the specific sense that it draws everything of human concern into its compass while simultaneously expanding science and technology's grasp of the larger cosmos, then the singularity can be hypothetically identified, in part, with the aspirations of philosophy. Philosophy, so conceived, marks no fundamental distinction between philosophy and science. While science emphasizes analysis, philosophy emphasizes synthesis, especially the most comprehensive synthesis of knowledge in the form of information. But the attempt to synthesize all knowledge leads to the problem of simultaneously synthesizing self-knowledge, and any inherent philosophic problems with such attempts. Philosophy leads to ruthless reasoning about all. All includes science, but also all non-science, i.e. intuition and that which goes under the name of subjectivity. In other words, philosophy includes science but also the problems and limits of science. Philosophy includes the conflict between science and the scientist. Philosophy includes the philosophical reflection upon the limits of philosophy. Totality of rational comprehension of all leads to philosophy and, within science proper, cosmology. The speck of provincial human-centric concerns is dwarfed by a contemporary physical cosmology that may, in turn, be dwarfed by future discoveries of what lies beyond it. So at one extreme there are human-centric concerns, politics, and at another extreme that the far larger physical world beyond life from Earth. The modern attempt to unite these two extremes through cosmopolitanism or a cosmopolis is illusory in the sense that the old provincialism of political holism has only been replaced by a new provincialism of individualism. The fundamentally non-cosmopolitan or non-universal bias, in other words, stems from one's will to live. The relation between science and philosophy is, in part, like the relation between science and the scientist. Some presume that philosophy is a relic of primitive science or a stage before the development of a modern science that has now superseded philosophy. But is it possible to have science without a scientist? Is the scientist the sole object of inquiry excluded from science, as if the scientist were the sole supernatural phenomenon? Those scenarios where it is conceivable that subjectivity and objectivity can be separated are fit for science, whereas those scenarios where it is inconceivable that subjectivity and objectivity can be separated are considered unscientific. However, If there can be a theory of everything, it must also account for those unscientific scenarios where subjectivity and objectivity cannot be separated. Approaching the greatest possible objectivity may be like approaching a limit in calculus. The limit is a state of death. The common breach between science and philosophy is related to the issue of self-consistency. But what if subjective inconsistency is actually a condition of objectivity? As a scientist, a form of bio-inconsistent subjectivity may the condition of scientific objectivity. The distinction between the scientist and the human being, i.e. the distinction between facts and values, suggests a break of standards. Does the scientist hold the same scientific standards in determining his or her life values? Sociobiology implicates this subject-object problem, the problem of the scientist as an object of science. Sociobiology implicates sociobiological study of the behavior of the sociobiologist. Sociobiology implicates sociobiological self-consciousness and the possibility of a self-conscious science of sociobiological self-consciousness. Sociobiology raises not only the prospect of the scientific study of the values of scientists, but the question of the value of science itself. The value of objectivity. Can sociobiology be a values-free science? Better yet, can polysociobiology be a values-free science? Merging political science and sociobiology in polysociobiology makes the scientific study of values, including the values of the scientist, almost inescapable. To be a polysociobiologist, in the fullest sense, is to attempt to give a scientific account of one's own values. The evolution of science leads, not away from philosophy, but towards philosophy. The search for objectivity comes full circle in the search for the sources of subjectivity. A science of the scientist, a vivisection or auto-vivisection of the scientist, is an investigation into the limits of objectivity. What could it mean to be completely objective? There might possibly be absolute knowledge or absolute objective. If knowledge or objectivity never comes into an unresolvable conflict with a subjective priority of the observer, i.e. the conditions of the observer's existence. In other words, total objectivity might be possible only if one does not have political position or opinion, if one does not participate in a political social existence as well as a scientific one. Is such a life possible? This would imply that the greatest objectivity would be premised on indifference to the difference between existence and non-existence. It seems that only indifference to one's existence offers the possibility of overcoming politics. While philosophy is metapolitical, and especially suprapolitical, the philosopher cannot escape being political insofar as the philosopher cannot escape concern with the problem of existence, i.e. survival. Politics is nothing only when one conceives the value of existence as nothing. The standpoint from which I say that there is no fundamental distinction between politics and non-politics is identical to a position that posits that life is totally meaningless and that the choice of death for myself and everyone else is no better than the choice for life. The Athenians put Socrates to death for a reason. Chapter break. Overcoming bias. Death is the true inspiring genius, or the muse of philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer. How far can I go in making value-free scientific judgments? Tracing the biases that hinder objectivity, and attempting to uproot those biases, leads towards the notion that self-preservation itself is a bias. If life has no inherent meaning, then self-preservation cannot be judged fundamentally superior to self-destruction, or vice versa. Self-preservation exerts bias, for example, in a bias against this very observation that self-preservation is not fundamentally superior to self-destruction. Knowledge, wrote Arthur Schopenhauer, far from being the source of attachment to life, even works against it, for it discloses the worthlessness of life, and thus combats the fear of death. 1418 What is fundamentally without reason is the will to live, or, from a more Darwinian perspective, the blind watchmaker of evolution cannot be assumed the fountainhead of ultimate reason. Life is a prejudice that happens to be talented at perpetuating or replicating itself. To attempt to eliminate this source of bias is to open your mind to death. The attempt to eliminate all sources of bias leads towards the most intransigent sources of prejudice. Prejudices such as biological drives, instincts, and values that counter objectivity. A primary source of values is an unconscious fear of death. From one scientific point of view, fear of death can be viewed as genetically adaptive. From another scientific point of view, fear of death is a subjective bias that can hinder objective evaluation. For scientific objectivity to take precedence, the subjective bias of the fear of death must be subordinated to scientific objectivity. This implies that the attempt to maximize scientific objectivity could result in an increase in genetically maladaptive behavior. If so, could the attempt to maximize scientific objectivity result in a maximization of genetically maladaptive behavior? Could the attempt to remove all sources of prejudice, bias, and subjectivity amount to rational self-destruction? Is to most fully approach objectivity to approach death. If a scientist is rigorously objective, and eliminates all oughts or prescriptions, does this lead to indifference to the survival, not only of a given individual, but indifference to the survival of all life? The most rigorous objectivity implies indifference to the consequence of objectivity, i.e. whether the consequences of objectivity yield life or death for the observer. In other words, the elimination of subjectivity demands indifference to self-preservation. When self-preservation conflicts with objectivity, the attempt at rigorous objectivity could potentially counter the interests of self-preservation or even amount to rational self-destruction. The most total objectivity appears to lead to the most total self-negation. Objectivity towards biological factors is objectivity towards life factors. Indifference to life factors leads to indifference between the choices of life and death. To approach objectivity with respect to self-interest ultimately leads to indifference to whether one is alive or dead. The dead are most indifferent, the least interested, the least biased, the least prejudiced one way or the other. What is closest to total indifference is to be dead. If an observer hypothesizes death, then, from that perspective, the observer has no vested interests in life and thus possible grounds for the most objective view. The more an observer is reduced to nothing, the more the observer is no longer a factor, the more the observer might set the conditions for the most rigorous objectivity. It is likely that most people will not even consider the veracity of this correlation between death and objectivity even if they understand it intellectually, because most will consciously or unconsciously choose to place the interests of self-preservation over the interests of objectivity. In other words, to even consider the validity of this view assumes that one is willing and able to even consider prioritizing objectivity over one's own self-preservation. Since it's not safe to simply assume this on an individual level, let alone a social level, relatively few are willing and able to seriously address this issue, and majority consensus can be expected to dismiss the issue. In short, for most people, including most scientists, overcoming self-preservation is not ultimately a subject for rational debate and objective discussion. Maximizing objectivity can be incompatible with maximizing subjective interests in some situations. Anything less than death is compromise. The choice between objectivity and self-preservation may lead one to a Stoic choice between life and death. Whereas the humanities cannot be what they are without human subjectivities, the inhumanities, or hard sciences, require the subjective element be removed as much as possible as sources of error. Objectivity leads towards the elimination of subjectivity, i.e. the elimination of one's humanity. A value-free science has no basis on which to value human things over non-human things, and thus no basis to value life over death or vice versa. Social science will become equal to the standards of physical science when social scientists overcome the subjective preference for the life of humanity over the death of humanity. To attempt to resolve the contradiction of myself as a scientist and a human being on the side of science leads towards viewing myself as a material object. While this contradiction may be impossible to resolve, the closest approximation of reconciliation may consist of the state of death. In death, the teleologically inclining biases of human subjectivity that hinder one from viewing oneself as a material object are eliminated. I cannot fully reconcile my understanding of the world with my existence in it. There is a conflict between the value of objectivity and the facts of my life. This experiment is designed to demonstrate a point of incompatibility between truth and life. In this experiment I hypothesize that the private separation of facts and values, when disclosed to the wider social world, creates a conflict of interest between the value of sociobiological objectivity and the facts of my sociobiological existence, such that it leads to a voluntary and rational completion of this work in an act of self-destruction. Chapter break. Science as technology as science. Return to main text. The scientist is a paradox. Scientists are characterized by interestedness in disinterestedness. If a scientist is disinterestedness. However, that is the end of science. The goal of disinterestedness or objectivity requires interestedness or subjectivity. Are there objective grounds for choosing the goal of objectivity over more consistently subjective goals? The goal of objectivity, if consistent, leads to indifference to the choice between objectivity and subjectivity. The goal of objectivity undermines the goal of objectivity. If totally indifferent, it seems impossible to choose between objectivity and subjectivity. The problem here is self-consistent objectivity. Objectivity undermines the subjective impetus that produces science. If subjectivity is eliminated for the sake of objectivity, then the motive for objectivity is also eliminated. Totally eliminate the subjective blind spot behind science, and science will be eliminated. If so, then science, if objective about itself, terminates itself. Science is not justified scientifically. If this is correct, it implies that a subjective, blind spot is the condition of science. The very existence of scientists' objectivity is dependent upon the subjectivity of the scientist. Objectivity is animated by subjectivity and, therefore, science cannot be fully separated from culture, i.e. values. Objectivity is possible only for subjective minds. Does this mean that scientists are people that must believe in nothing? No, it means precisely the opposite. To pursue science, scientists must be justified by something that, strictly speaking, is not science itself, i.e. curiosity, wonder, faith in science, the will to master all knowledge, belief that it will benefit the world, belief in pure knowledge for its own sake, or some other breach of objectivity. Because science, apparently, cannot consistently justify itself, something else must if it is to exist at all. The attempt to eliminate all subjective bias would culminate in the elimination of science, for science has failed to produce evidence that it is capable of fully justifying itself. The very existence of science is the strongest evidence that scientists are less than fully objective. And attempted self-consistent objectivity is a self-destructing objectivity, since the bias of the subjective belief in the value of objectivity must be removed to be objective. This implies that an objective theory of all could not account for itself. How, then, does a scientist choose a subject to study? Is there a way to objectively determine what the subject of objectivity should be? Is there a fundamentally objective reason for choosing the study of archaeology over the study of chemistry? Is the decision to study Sanskrit over Chinese more rational than the decision to worship Allah over not worshiping Allah? Is there a fundamentally rational ground for making one choice over another? Even once one has decided on some facet of reality, there is still the problem of interpretation. Consider the interpretation that my interpretation is just a way of throwing order upon the chaos of the world. Is this interpretation itself just a way of throwing order on the chaos of the world? Even the word chaos imposes a kind of order over things, which cannot be put into words. In any case, if objectivity cannot justify itself, then objectivity is subjective in the sense of being selective. One must always determine what the dominant factors are. What is important? The value of facts. Some facts are valued at the expense of others. Some things are selected for study, while others are neglected or demoted. I can find no definitive, objective way to choose one subject or field of inquiry over another. Why am I even reflecting on this problem right now at the expense of some other problem? This work thus appears, by definition, subjective, in that I chose certain domains as subjects of objectivity at the expense of others. How, then, can I justify the subjects I choose to be objective about? The question of how to be most objective leads to the question of how I am most subjective. What are my own most significant subjectivities or biases? Is this very evaluation necessarily subjective? How can I determine objectively what is most subjective for me? Since the domains or fields of inquiry are commonly skewed towards those areas that one is subjectively inclined towards, the attempt at the greatest possible objectivity raises the possibility of seeking out and confronting precisely what one is least inclined to study. The attempt at the greatest possible objectivity raises the possibility of choosing subjects for scientific objectivity that are the most intractably subjective for me, the areas that expose my greatest biases, the areas I am most likely to gloss over, repress, or marginalize. The question of how to approach the greatest objectivity leads to the question of my very greatest subjectivities. Death, and fear of death, can be one of the greatest sources of subjectivity, and this is precisely why it may be one of the best means of testing and measuring the limits of objectivity. My objectivity simultaneously reveals something of my subjectivity, for one must be interested in disinterestedness. Not all scientists are equally interested in all expressions of disinterestedness. Objectivity cannot be but inseparable from subjectivity, including meta-objective observations such as this one. To have a point of view betrays bias, for it may be incompatible with other justifiable points of view. A premise or viewpoint is a kind of bias, including this one. One's prejudices and biases, the condition of having a point of view, can reveal what one is or what one is becoming. In revealing my viewpoint, I reveal something of what I am. Reflection on what is most objective leads to reflection upon what is most biased and subjective. What are, for me, the most pressing, outstanding, and repeated exceptions to rigorous objectivity? As a Jewish sociobiologist aspiring to objectivity, I found that the Jewish race question persistently arose as a source of my greatest potential subjectivities. One cannot fully account for my theories without accounting for my Jewish heritage. This is not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but rather, the product of a search for knowledge inextricably interwoven with the problem of self-knowledge. The most powerful biases are also those most likely to survive the attempt at objectivity. The Jewish race question is a test of my objectivity because it could be a source of my greatest subjectivity. Since the Jewish race question has proved to be an existential question, the only way I am able to gain a point of view that could conceivably overcome this peak subjectivity is to hypothetically overcome the deeper subjectivity of the will to live. While sociobiology adds objective biological factors, the sociobiologist, as a scientist, subtracts biological factors that bias the scientific method, and subtracting all biasing biological factors leads to the subtraction of the sociobiologist's own biological life from the scientific equation. Radical objectivity towards subjectivity would mean attempting honesty to the point of absurdity. To focus on rooting out the deepest sources of subjectivity amounts to seeking out those truths that are most destructive to subjectivity, i.e. self-interest. It is to make a specialty of truths that kill. If I had no biases, I would be dead, rather than sitting here right now, writing about them. To approach the most biasless state of death is to pursue a course of rational self-destruction through a rigorous elimination of biases towards life. Yet to be value-neutral would be to not be biased towards objectivity over subjectivity or vice versa. While objectivity is not inherently self-justified as an end in itself, objectivity could be a means. Objectivity could be a means, for example, of rational self-destruction. The experiment I propose entails treating objectivity as a means of promoting the overcoming of the bias towards life and overcoming the bias towards life as a means of promoting objectivity. Since objectivity cannot fundamentally justify itself as an end, objectivity can be a means of rational self-destruction by eliminating the prejudice against death or self-destruction. But why, then, is rational self-destruction or death my chosen goal or end? While the choice of which field of inquiry one selects to be objective about includes subjective decisions, the greatest objectivity implies overcoming the greatest subjectivity. Fear of, or resistance to, death is among the sources of the greatest subjectivity, and, for that reason, central to an attempt to approach the greatest objectivity. In general, The fields of inquiry I try to value are those that are most destructive to me as a living observer, because they are most self-destructive. This experiment thus involves approaching objectivity as a means of self-destruction, and self-destruction as a means of approaching objectivity. Put another way, it is using science as technology, objectivity as a means of self-destruction, and technology as science, self-destruction as means of approaching objectivity. How far would one be willing to go in pursuit of scientific objectivity? Objectivity and survival are least compatible when objectivity becomes a means of life, subordinate to life, as opposed to life subordinated to objectivity. If the greatest objectivity implicates confronting the most subjective biases, this implicates confronting those truths that most conflict with the subjective will to live. By simply changing my values from life values to death values, and setting my trajectory for rational biological self-destruction, I am able to liberate myself from many of the biases that dominate the horizons of most people's lives. By valuing certain scientific observations because they are destructive to my life, one, and removing self-preservation factors that hinder objectivity. This is how I am in a position to hypothesize my own death. So if objectivity is not justified as end, then objectivity can be a means of rational self-destruction through the overcoming of the bias towards life. Rational self-destruction through the overcoming of the bias towards life, in turn, can be a means of achieving objectivity, and this means to will death as a means of willing truth, and to will truth as a means of willing death.